Hello, this is Garth Noyes. Sometime in late 2015, under the pseudonym G.K. Flint, I released the first episode of A History of the King James Bible podcast. The genesis, no pun intended, of the series occurred in 2011 on the 400th anniversary of the publication of the King James Version of the Bible. At that time, I went looking for a podcast series about the King James Version and found while there were a few standalone releases, there was no in-depth series about this most important book. I thought to myself, someone should do that. At the time, I didn't think that person would be me. A few years later, I again went online looking for a series concerning the history of the King James Version of the Bible. It still hadn't been done, so I thought, I'm going to have a crack at it. I then gathered some resources, did the research, and hit record. Over the course of about 18 months, beginning in late 2015, I released 22 episodes of the series, the final episode being released in June 2017. Since its release, I have received the occasional email from listeners, some to thank me for the series, and others asking if there will be further episodes. I have no plans to add to the series, but I thought perhaps I should share the series on YouTube so that others might have a chance to hear it. Which brings us to October 2020, and the series now being made available on YouTube. Any references to the now defunct website or different email addresses can be ignored as you go through the series. If you do wish to contact me, you can email me at gkjames1611@gmail.com. That's gkjames1611 gkjames1611@gmail.com. I will check this email intermittently, so please be patient if you do write. I have already stated the reason I decided to create this series, but my research into the translators unquestionably motivated me to get the research down and to hit record. It is clearly my favourite part of this work. So I am now thrilled anew in October and November of 2020 to offer on YouTube my study on the translators of the King James Bible. Time has moved on again since I decided to put this series up on YouTube. I've been very busy, so there's been some delay in getting the final videos done. It's now mid-2021, and I hope you are still enjoying the series. So here now for your enjoyment is my original series, A History of the King James Bible podcast.
Welcome, friends, to A History of the King James Bible podcast. To find more episodes and information, just go to our website, www.ahistoryofthekingjamesbiblepodcast.com. Now here is GK with the latest episode.
Greetings and welcome to A History of the King James Bible podcast. It is September 2016 and this is episode 16 of the series. The title for this episode is The Second Oxford Company, Part A. As with the first Oxford Company, we will examine this panel over 2 episodes, and as a preview of my opinion on this one, this panel contains some of my least favourite translators. How's that for an opinion? You're going to find out why I say that soon enough, but aside from that, this panel has some firsts. For example, it is the only panel where one of its members committed accidental homicide, and King James had to appoint a commission to try the matter, which had ecclesiastical ramifications. It also contains the most handsome translator. Boy, oh boy, we really do track down the details for you here, don't we? In fact, I spend as much time tracking down details like that for this series as some bushman will track down a goanna running through the bush, so there you go. I want to say thanks to everyone who has been sharing the show faithfully. Thank you for taking the time and being a part of it and sharing it, and I really appreciate that. And also thank you to everyone who's taken the time to write. Greetings to you, Laurie from Kansas City. Thank you for your feedback. I appreciate that, and I enjoyed our emails that we shared together. Also, a big g'day to everyone down there in Sydney. I was born in Sydney, but like a lot of us that were born there, we can't live there anymore. It's just too busy and it's just too big. But I do love the place. I love you all down there. God bless. Thanks for tuning in. Okay, now let's get to the show. I hope you will enjoy this one, and I'm going to ask you not to laugh too much when we get to my Geneva Bible, King James Bible, and my New Testament Greek comparison. I've going to do some Greek with you. We're going to do a little bit of Greek in this episode, just for a bit of fun and a bit of a comparison that I've plucked out of the book of Revelation. I hope you enjoy it, but I can guarantee you will not have heard Greek pronounced like this before. Well, maybe you have if it's an Australian with an accent like mine. Enough of my rambling. Let's get to the show. Here we go. The Second Oxford Company translated about half of the New Testament. They translated the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, the book of Acts, and the book of Revelation. The Second Westminster lads covered Romans to Jude. We'll get to them in an upcoming episode. But for now, let's talk about the Second Oxford Company. Just one more thing before we get to that. I should have included this part in my rant earlier. I want to make it clear that in upcoming episodes, we will take a closer look at the outcome of the translators' labours. That means we will examine a little closer than we have so far the King James Version. But for now, let's kick off with a very brief overview, some of what the Second Oxford Company men translated before we get to the translators themselves. Here now is a portion from Opfel about the work of the Second Oxford Company. Opfel writes that Tyndale was the major influence upon the work of the Second Oxford men. Now, as many as you will know, Tyndale's translation was the first English Bible to draw directly from the Hebrew and Greek texts, and the first English Bible to be printed on the recently invented printing press. Recently in those days, not recently now. Let's find out which other versions the Second Oxford gents used, but you're going to hear now just how much they did rely on Tyndale, but they also used other versions as well. Let's get to that now.
A second important source was Coverdale, his Bible of 1535 and the Great Bible, a third Geneva, a fourth the Bishop's version. From the Taverner Bible and the rest New Testament, the Second Oxford Company borrowed less. In the Gospel of St. John, it sometimes echoed Wycliffe. The Beatitudes are almost straight Tyndale, except for the italicized words, the verses are just as he wrote them. And seeing the multitudes, he went up into a mountain, and when he was set, his disciples came unto him. And he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are they which do hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. Blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Matthew 5, 1-10. In verse 11, Tyndale had written, Blessed are ye when men revile you, and persecute you, and shall falsely say all manner of evil things against you for my sake. To find effect, the King James men changed the word order, and, like Geneva, omitted sayings. Blessed are ye when men shall revile you, and persecute you, and shall say all manner of evil against you, falsely for my sake. The Lord's Prayer was written practically unchanged from Tyndale, who in 1534 had written, O our Father which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Let thy kingdom come, thy will be fulfilled as well in earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive our trespassers. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and power and the glory forever. The Second Oxford Company gave this. Our Father which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done in earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. for thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever. Matthew 6, 9-13. Coverdale had used debts and debtors in place of trespassers and trespassers. In Matthew 11, 28-30, the changes are minimal, but there is a decided gain in the finer points of rhythm and grace. In Tyndall, "Come unto me, all ye that labour and are laden, and I will ease you. Take my yoke on you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and you shall find rest unto your souls, for my yoke is easy, and my burden is light." In the King James, "Come unto me, all ye that labour and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and ye shall find rest unto your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light." Still another passage from Matthew shows the Oxford Company scholars' facility for selection and combination. In Tyndall, "Painted tombs which appear beautiful outward." In the Geneva, "Whited tombs which appear beautiful outward." In the Bishops, "Painted sepulchres which indeed appear beautiful outward." And the King James, "White sepulchres which indeed appear beautiful outward." Matthew 23:27. Elsewhere, as in John 14:27, the Second Oxford Company improved on the rhythms. In the Tyndall, "Let not your heart be grieved, neither fear ye." In the King James, "Let not your heart be troubled, neither let it be afraid." Or again in John 15:13. In the Tyndall, "Greater love than this hath no man, than that a man bestow his life for his friends." In the King James, "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." Like the First Oxford Company, the Second, seeking musical variety, sometimes gave different renderings of two passages, which are identical in the original Greek. In Matthew 26:41, "The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." In Mark 14:38, "The spirit truly is ready, but the flesh is weak." From the simple phraseology of the Gospels, the Oxfordmen passed to the exultant visions of the Apocalypse. Sometimes they made gains with only a change in word order. In the Bishops, "And swear by him that liveth for evermore, which created heaven and the things that therein are, and the earth and the things that therein are, and the sea and the things which therein are, that there should be no longer time." In the King James, "And swear by him that liveth for ever and ever, who created heaven and the things that therein are, and the earth and the things that therein are, and the sea and the things which are therein, that there should be time no longer." Revelation 10:6. At another place in Revelation, they wisely discarded the Geneva trimmed for the Bishops adorned. In the Geneva, "And I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, come down from God out of heaven, prepared as a bride trimmed for her husband." In the King James, "And I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down from God out of heaven, prepared as a bride, adorned for her husband." Revelation 21:2. Or they added a few syllables. In the Tyndall, "For the old things are gone." In the King James, "For the former things are passed away." 21:4.
Okay, so that is an ever so brief overview of some of this panel's work. Did you hear there how they even translated differently two verses of scripture that are identical in the Greek? For the sake of musical variety, according to Opfel, those passages are Matthew 26:41 and Mark 14:38. Now, just so you don't think I point this out with the intention of intimating that these guys didn't know their Greek, it is one of the accusations levelled against the King James Version translators, is that their Greek was not up to scratch because they were so imbued with Latin. I think if you've taken notice since we've been discussing the translators, you'll be aware just how many of them were Regius professors and the like in Greek. I reckon they had the Greek covered personally, in my opinion. But look, let me share with you a comparison with the Geneva that will demonstrate that, in my opinion, they indeed know how to handle their Greek. And bear in mind, this would just be one of many examples. And I just plucked this out of the book of Revelation because I went there to see how they stacked up against the Geneva when it came to talking about the beast of chapter 13. And to be honest, the book of Revelation, the Greek in the book of Revelation is quite simple Greek. It's quite simple, Koine or New Testament Greek. And I just love reading it when I'm practicing my Greek because it's quite easy. And so many words are repeated in there as well. So it's a good one, in my opinion, to learn from, just as is the Gospel of John. Okay, so let's take a look at this. This is my opinion and my little comparison here. So this is in the book of Revelation, chapter 13, verse 11. The second beast is the focus, that beast being the false prophet, as per Revelation chapter 16, verse 13. Now, what we're going to do here, and if you have your Bible handy, turn there now and cast an optic nerve over the verse. Now, of course, don't do this while you're driving or you're up a ladder or milking a cow or whatever you're doing at the moment. But if you're sitting at home in your easy chair, rip open your King James Version of the Bible and open it up to Revelation chapter 13. And what we're going to do, we're going to make a comparison here. We're going to look at a comparison here between the Geneva, which I personally think is also a very good version of the Bible. It's in English. It came out before the King James Version. It's a very good version. We're going to look at that. We're going to look at the King James Version, and we're going to read some Greek from the Stephanus 1550 version. Let's see what we find here. Geneva, Revelation, chapter 13, verse 11. And I beheld another beast coming out of the earth, which had two horns like the lamb, but he spoke like the dragon. Now, I just want you to take note here how many times in that version they use the word the. Okay, so that's what you're listening for when I read the King James Version, and then we're going to examine why I'm talking about that. Okay, so here's the King James, Revelation 13, chapter 11. You got yours open? You ready to roll? And I beheld another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had two horns like a lamb, and he spoke as a dragon. All right, okay, so now what I want you to notice there is that the Geneva version emphasizes two horns like the lamb, and the King James version says he had two horns like a lamb. So what do you think's going on here? Well, I went and had a look in the Stephanus. I could have chosen a number of different antique Greek versions or modern Greek versions, which I enjoy to read, all of them. And I'm going to read you my very stilted Aussie pronounced Greek, New Testament Koine Greek, 1550 Stephanus, Revelation 13. Ki edon, allo therion, anabainon, ek tais geis. Ki eken, kerata duo homoia, anio ki elale, hos drakon. All right, now that won't mean a lot to you unless you're reading along in your Greek New Testament as well, or you can speak Greek with an Aussie accent. But what we're noticing here, we're going to have to do a little lesson here on a particular word. Now, we're going to speak about something that the Greeks gave to us and something that without it we would be absolutely lost. And that is the word the. Well, kinda the word the. In English, we have two articles, definite article and the indefinite article. So, for example, we have the car, the man, the whatever, which is definite, right? That's a definite article. Most of you are going to know this. You learn it at school. I didn't. I was away from school that day, so I missed it. So I had to relearn it when I was learning to read New Testament Greek, but that's okay. Now, in Koine or New Testament Greek, the definite article, the definite, has 24 different forms, and it's used over 20,000 times. That's pretty amazing, isn't it? 24 different forms used over 20,000 times. But here's an amazing thing. The New Testament Greek does not have and does not use the indefinite article. Now, before you write to me and say that's not quite so, there's ways they get around it, it can be this way, that way. The two best Greek scholars in the land at present, both of their textbooks will say it definitely does not have the indefinite article, okay? I have seen where ancient Greek has a way around it, but we're specifically talking about New Testament Greek here. Now, this is not going to be a complete lesson on the Greek article. One of my textbooks, it takes over 50 pages to discuss the use of the article in New Testament Greek. And so this is just for interest's sake, and it's just my humble opinion. I'm not a scholar, I'm a student. And believe me, if you ever get to see any of my report cards from ye old school days, you would completely agree with what one of my teachers wrote. For example, one of them said, "The improvement in this student's handwriting has revealed his inability to spell." Ha! She must have been talking about someone else, because my handwriting is worse than any doctor's, and that's really saying something. Then there was this absolutely charming comment on another report card of mine. It said, "Despite his best efforts, I can report that at least his education has not gone to his head." School days were happy days, weren't they? Back to the topic at hand. Simply speaking, the Greek does say the earth. So we're getting back to our... Let's move away from the humour. We're getting back to our verse here, okay? And I'm going to go back to King James. "And I beheld another beast coming up out of the earth," okay? And so both the Geneva and the King James say the earth. And so does the Greek. It says, ek tais geis, out of the earth, okay? However, this is where they differ. This is where the Geneva and the King James differ. And I think this is important. The Greek does not say like the lamb or like the dragon. The Greek says like a lamb and as a dragon. And so you will take note that the Geneva says, we'll go back there again. I wish you could see this. I hope you're reading along in your Bible. I need to be able to read these sort of things. Like if I was, you listening to me, I'd be saying, what is this guy on about? Can we just get back to the humour? Because I'd have to see it for myself. But the Geneva says like the lamb and like the dragon. King James Version, in my opinion, has got this one right because it aligns closely with the Greek. It says like a lamb and as a dragon, right? Spake as a dragon. Now, here's what I'm thinking. I'm not an expert here, but I reckon that perhaps the Geneva Version is trying to make the comparison between this false lamb, okay, and the lamb, okay, the Lamb of God. I'm just wondering if that's what they're doing here. Like, you have the counterfeit and the real, okay, so I'm just wondering if that's what they're getting at. I know in modern interpretations, especially in this part of the latter part of the 20th and the early part of the 21st century, we'd nod our heads and say, yes, the counterfeit and the real, right? Wouldn't we? Let's go with that argument. Let's say that that's what's going on here. They're saying, the lamb, like the lamb, all right? Well, so that you understand, okay, we're talking about a counterfeit one here. Let's say that that's what's going on here. Well, what they're probably getting at, what you would argue, say, okay, they're saying this is how far from the true lamb that the false lamb is, okay? It would say this is, they're miles apart. And really, depending on your eschatology here, but in short, right, what I'm trying to say is that the King James gets it right, in my opinion. All right, we'll leave that there for now because I've probably hammered that to death. And we will move on from a look at the work of the translators on this panel, and we'll go now and we'll meet some of the translators. In this episode, we've only got time to meet two of them, and we will meet the rest of them in the next episode.
You're listening to a History of the King James Bible podcast with GK. The series is now available on iTunes. Just go to iTunes and search for a History of the King James Bible podcast with G.K. Flint as the author. If you enjoy this series, please leave a rating and a review. You can also find links to every episode at our website. Just head to www.ahistoryofthekingjamesbiblepodcast.com. Now let's get back to this episode with your host, G.K.
chairman of the Second Oxford Company was Thomas Ravis. It's said that good Queen Bess was partial to a handsome dean of Christ Church College, and late in her reign she appointed the handsome but very serious Ravis to the deanship. Now, he's not the most handsome of all the translators. We're yet to meet the gentleman with that most important of distinctions, but Mr. Ravis here sounds like he was not only a handsome bloke, but he was also a bit of a tough cookie, having once up and deciding that everyone in the college should forego their meals for 2 bob a week, and then sent those who protested before the council. A tough cookie indeed. Born around 1560 in Old Maiden, Surrey, he was initially refused admission to Christ Church College on the grounds that the school was too full. But when Sir William Cecil, good Queen Bess's treasurer and the Chancellor of Cambridge, intervened on his behalf, the doors were swung open to the young student. And within 20 years he had obtained his DD, that ever-present Doctor of Divinity. He'd taken his holy orders and he had been elected proctor. Now that job sounds like it suited young Tom here. If you recall, a proctor's role was to hand out discipline at college, and it sounded like he enjoyed doing that indeed. In 1591 he was made rector of All Hallows Barking, and in 1592 he became canon of Westminster. You might recall a rector is a type of parish priest who received the greater and lesser tithes, and a vicar received the lesser tithes, and a canon, coming from the Latin canonicus, itself derived from the Greek kanonikos, relating to a rule, was a special title for a priest connected to a cathedral. There are other meanings to the term, and they have changed greatly over the years, but that's the basics of it. And I think it's important that you remember that most of these blokes were priests, and for many of them, their only income came from serving in and being connected to a parish or cathedral or what have you. Now, old mate Ravis here, for example, and at King James's request, mind you, was appointed Bishop of Gloucester, and at the same time he was allowed to retain his deanship of Christ Church, his prebend at Westminster, and his livings from his rectory of Islip and Whitnham Abbey at Berkshire. So you might recall that part of the deal for the translators was preferment in being appointed to these offices of churches around the country. And you can see that Ravis, for one, certainly benefited from the preferments. And that is while others struggled, as we've mentioned a couple of times. I think we might benefit by deferring to McClure here. As I read this, recall the protest by the Puritans against the so-called plural parsons, which is essentially what Ravis was. And I should also point out that Ravis was one of the 6 deans at the Hampton Court Conference, where the idea for a new Bible popped up, and he was known for his strong anti-Puritan stance. I hope that's not too much to take in, so take a few deep breaths and let's listen to some McClure. All these preferments and profitable livings mark him as a rising man. His holding a plurality of churches for the sake of their revenues, in neither of which he could perform the duties of the pastoral office, was one of the cases that justified the complaint of Lord Chancellor Ellesmere at the conference in Hampton Court. His lordship complained of this practice as occasioning many learned men at the universities to pine for want of places, while others had more than they could fill. I wish, therefore, said he, that some may have single coats or one living, before others have doublets or pluralities. To this the frugal Bancroft, then Bishop of London, who kept his own ribs thoroughly warmed with such investitures, made the thrifty reply, "But a doublet is necessary in cold weather." This prelate, a fierce persecutor of the Puritans, was reputed to have manifested very little saving grace, except in the way of penurious hoardings. The graceless wags of his day made this epitaph upon him: "Here lies his grace, in cold clay clad, who died for want of what he had." The pernicious custom of pluralities whereby a man receives tithes for the care of souls of which he takes no care, fleecing the flock he neither watches nor feeds, is one of those abuses still continued in the Church of England and calling for thorough reform. So remember, McClure is writing this in the 1850s. In 1604, soon after Dr. Ravis was commissioned as one of the Bible translators, the Lords of the Council requested his acceptance of the bishopric of Gloucester, for which there was very many eager suitors. 3 years later, he was translated to the bishopric of London. Anthony Wood says that he was first preferred to the See of Gloucester, which he reluctantly accepted on account of his having great learning, gravity, and prudence, and that through his diocese was pretty well stocked with those who could not bear the name of a bishop, yet, by episcopal living among them, he obtained their love and a good report from them. If he deserved this commendation while at Gloucester, he changed for the worse on his translation to London, where he not only succeeded the bitter Bancroft in his office, but also in his severe and exacting behaviour. So true is the mark that bishops and books are seldom the better for being translated. No sooner had he taken his seat in London than he stretched forth his hand to vex the non-conforming Puritans. Among others, he cited before him that holy and blessed man, Richard Rogers, for nearly 50 years the faithful minister of Wethersfield, than whom it is said, the Lord honoured none more in the conversion of souls. In the presence of this venerable man, who, for his close walking with God, was styled the Enoch of his day, Bishop Ravis protested, by the help of Jesus, I will not leave one preacher in my diocese who doth not subscribe and conform. So that's subscribing and conforming to the rites and rituals of the Anglican Church at the time. So you can hear here he's quite anti-Puritan, he's quite authoritarian, he likes to have more than one living. It sounds like he's doing quite well for himself, good old mate Thomas Ravis. In my humble opinion, he's not the most cheerful translator that we've examined so far. I think that's pretty obvious. It said that he was qualified, indeed, but he comes across as a bit of an intractable character. He died in 1609, 2 years before the publication of the Bible, so he didn't see it through to publication, but he was certainly there as the leader of this company. But what do you think of Mr. Ravis? I hope there was enough in there for you to get an idea of his character. Just rewind the cassette there a bit and have another listen to that segment. All right, as we go to our next translator, keep in mind the Thomas Ravis, the leader of this panel. Keep him in mind and see if you can find some similarities here between him and our next guy. So the next member of the Second Oxford Company was also a bit of a handsome bloke, apparently the most handsome man amongst the translators. See, we tracked down the minutest bit of info for you here on A History of the King James Bible podcast, and I think that's important, don't you? We're discussing none other than Sir Henry Savile, who had been knighted by King James, and not only was he the most handsome fella amongst this mob, he was also the only translator who had not taken holy orders, i.e. he was neither a priest, bishop, nor a deacon. Savile had a reputation as a Greek scholar and a mathematician, and had spent some time on the continent hunting for and collecting manuscripts for future works, which is other things that he's known for besides the translation here. In 1592 he married a wealthy widow, and that same year good Queen Bess came to Oxford, where Savile's younger brother was a proctor and he was the warden. During her visit he delivered a Latin oration. I should say at this point he was also known for his skill with Latin. So he delivered this oration, which ended with him eulogising about Gloriana and her victory over Spain 4 years earlier. Gloriana being another name for good Queen Bess, or Elizabeth I, as she's sometimes called. Now remember we spoke about good Queen Bess having an eye for a handsome bloke? Well, it's true. She was known as a flirt at court. Now, I'm not saying anything more than that about her character because she's known as the Virgin Queen. She was married to her country. But there is enough evidence out there to say that, hey, she was a flirt, all right? So we'll just leave it there. Okay, so Queen Bess had an eye for a handsome bloke. We know that. Anyway, Sir Henry was later her Greek tutor, which is a pretty important role if you think about it. But, you know, I remember seeing earlier that even when she was a child, Elizabeth was writing complete works in diaries and stuff in several languages. Now, I'm pretty sure as a young child, she was able to write fluently in Latin, and I'm not 100% sure about the rest of it. I haven't completely looked into that. But anyway, so Sir Henry was her Greek tutor. Now, it wasn't all beer and skittles with this bloke. He was both the warden of Merton College, where he was also a fellow, and he was provost of Eton. It was said of him that he was somewhat unpopular in his role as warden. It's a position that he held for 38 years. But he wasn't very popular because of his autocratic manner. A warden is the head of the college, and Merton College has an unbroken line of wardens going back to 1264. And the provost is the chairman of the governing body of Eton College. So he is chosen by the Crown and is assisted by a vice provost and 10 fellows. So Saville was known as a strict disciplinarian at both Eton and Merton, if that's making sense as we're going along here. This guy and Ravis have a bit in common, it seems, handsome and both very bossy blokes. One story about him goes that he was told about a young scholar who was known as a good wit. Saville, on hearing this, harumphed and replied, "Out upon him! Give me the plodding student. If I would look for wits, I would go to the prison. There be wits." Isn't that nice of him? Real nice, mate. Before we move on, I want to share something else of note about his holding the provostship of Eton. Remember we said that he was the only translator not to take holy orders? Well, there was a statute that stated that the provost of Eton College must be a priest, which he wasn't. Well, working through connections he had with Sir Robert Cecil, he eventually convinced the Queen that she had the right to override statutes because of her divine right, and that is how he gained the position of provost at Eton without having to take holy orders. As an aside, and this is just a bit of an aside here, you know, we just mentioned Robert Cecil. Lizzie called Cecil her little man. Apparently he was short. And later, James called him my little beagle. I'm not sure he would have been too impressed with that. But moving on, let's again turn to McClure, who wrote in the 1850s, for a little bit more on Saville. He can tell you much more than I can, that's for sure. In his 29th year, he travelled in France and elsewhere to perfect himself in literature, and returned highly accomplished in learning, languages, and knowledge of the world and men. He then became tutor in Greek and mathematics to Queen Elizabeth, whose father, Henry VIII, is said by Southey to have set the example of giving to daughters a learned education. So, you know, we might have things to say about Henry VIII and his treatment and view of women, but one of the things he did do was he made sure his girls had a good education. And I think that's a wise move then and now. But let's just move on. It is to her highest honour that when she had been more than 20 years upon the throne, she still kept up her habits of study, as appears by this appointment of Mr. Saville. In 1686 he was made warden of Merton College, which office he filled with great credit for 36 years, and also to the great prosperity of the institution. 10 years later he added to this office that of Provost of Eton, which school rapidly increased in reputation under him. Thus, as Fuller says, this skilful gardener had, at the same time, a nursery of young plants and an orchard of grown trees, both flourishing under his careful inspection. Soon after his nomination as one of the translators, having declined all offers of other promotion, whether civil or ecclesiastical, he was knighted by the king. About the same time, he buried his only son Henry at the age of 8 years. In consequence of this bereavement, he devoted most of his wealth to the promotion of learning. He translated the histories of Cornelius Tacitus and published the same with notes. He also published from the manuscripts the writings of Bradwarden against Pelagius, the writers of English history subsequent to Bede, prelections on the elements of Euclid, and other learned works in English and Latin. He is chiefly known, however, by being the first to edit the complete works of John Chrysostom, the most famous of the Greek fathers. He spent large sums in procuring from all parts of Europe manuscripts and copies of manuscripts. He not only made learned and critical notes on his favourite author, but procured those of Andrew Downes and John Boyce, two of his fellow labourers on the translation of the Bible. His edition of 1,000 copies was published in 1613 and makes 8 immense folio. All his expenses in this labour of love amounted to above £8,000, of which the paper alone cost a fourth part. Now in 1850s, he's saying here, there's a note at the bottom, here's a footnote saying that in the 1850s, that was valued at more than $300,000. So you can see that now that figure of £8,000 is going to run into millions of dollars. Easily millions of dollars. It was 50 years before all the copies were sold. The Benedictines in Paris, however, through their emissaries in England, succeeded in surreptitiously procuring the labours of the learned knight, sheet by sheet, as they came from the press. These they reprinted as they were received, adding a Latin translation and some other considerable matter, and forming 13 mighty folios. By this transaction the friars may have gained the most glory, but surely are not entitled to much honour. Ooh, those sneaky little Benedictine friars. Sir Henry Savile also founded 2 professorships at Oxford with liberal endowments, one of geometry and the other of astronomy. It is related of him that he once chanced to fall in with a Master Briggs of the rival University of Cambridge. In a learned encounter, Briggs succeeded in demonstrating some point in opposition to the previous opinion of Sir Henry. This pleased the worthy knight so well that he appointed Mr. Briggs to one of his professorships. So he did a bit of headhunting here, it seems. He made other valuable benefactions to Oxford in land, money and books. Many of his books are still in the Bodleian Library there. Sir Henry Savile died at Eton College, where he was buried February 19th, 1621, in his 72nd year. He was styled that magazine of learning, whose memory shall be honourable among the learned and the righteous forever. He left an only daughter, Elizabeth, who was married to Sir John Sedley, a wealthy baronet of Kent. Sir Henry's wife was Margaret, daughter of George Darcres of Cheshunt, Esquire. It is said that Sir Henry was a handsome man, and that no lady could boast a finer complexion. He was so much of a bookworm and so sedulous at his study that his lady, who was not very deep in such matters, thought herself neglected. She once petulantly said to him, "Sir Henry, I would that I were a book, and then you would a little more respect me." A person standing by was so ungallant as to reply, "Madam, you ought to be an almanac, that he might change at the year's end." Oh, that's not very polite, is it? Saying should be an almanac that he might change at the end of the year. At this retort, the lady was not a little offended. A little before the publication of Chrysostom, when Sir Henry lay sick, Lady Savile said that if Sir Harry died, she would burn Chrysostom for killing her husband. To this, Mr. Boyce, who rendered Sir Henry much assistance in that laborious undertaking, meekly replied that so to do were great pity. To him the lady said, "Why, who was Chrysostom?" "One of the sweetest preachers since the Apostles' times," answered the enthusiastic Boyce, whereupon the lady was much appeased and said she would not burn him for all the world. From these precious samples it may be inferred that your fine lady is much the same in all ages of the world, no matter whom she may marry. Hear, hear. Good women need to be appreciated then and now. It is enough for our purpose that Sir Henry Savile was one of the most profound, exact, and critical scholars of his age, and meet and ripe to take a prominent part in the preparation of our incomparable version. Well, isn't that nice? So that's Sir Henry Savile. Quite a harsh character. handsome bloke, very studious, a scholar, all of those things there that you heard, but also unpopular, I believe, with some of his students and people that work with and for him. That's what I get. Well, that's it for another episode. What did you think of that one? I hope you enjoyed it. That was a bit longer than normal, that one. I didn't realise it was going to go for that long, but that's the reason we're doing a two-parter for these guys. The next episode won't be as long. I think it'll be quite a short one, to be honest. And I will have an announcement to make next episode, so be sure to tune in for that. Thank you to everyone for your lovely emails, all your messages of support and encouragement. Truly appreciate that. Thank you to every one of you who faithfully shares the show every episode. Really appreciate that. And so until next time, take care of yourself. God bless. And hooroo.